It started out as a quiet weekend escape, just me and my old cabin tucked away deep in the woods. I wasn't looking for trouble, only a little peace in the valley that's been in my family for generations. But if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you already know that peace doesn't last long when the wrong person decides you don't belong. That person, in my case, was Karen. She was the kind of neighbor who thought every inch of land was under her control. And the moment she spotted me unloading firewood, she came storming down the dirt road demanding I leave her property. At first, I tried to explain. I told her I'd been coming to this cabin for years, that this place was part of my family's history. But she wasn't having it. Her voice got louder, her tone sharper, and within minutes, she was threatening to call the HOA board. See it in her eyes, this wasn't just about a cabin. To her, it was about power. Then came the moment that shocked me. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, reporting that I was trespassing. Imagine standing on land your family has cared for and being treated like a criminal. The sirens in the distance made my heart race, but instead of panicking, I knew it was time to let the truth come out. Because what Karen didn't realize was that I wasn't just the owner of the cabin. I owned the entire valley. The look on her face when she found out. Well, let's just say the story was only getting started. The police car rolled up the gravel road, lights flashing against the trees, and Karen stood there with her arms crossed like she was about to win some kind of neighborhood battle. I could tell she'd rehearsed her story, ready to paint me as a trespasser who had no right to be anywhere near the cabin. To her, this was just another case of the HOA stepping in and protecting the community. But what she didn't know was that this valley wasn't under any HOA control at all. The board liked to act as if they owned every road, every tree, every creek, but the truth was much more complicated. My grandfather had bought this land decades ago, long before a single HOA contract was ever written. The cabin was built with his own hands, and over the years, the property boundaries had expanded, stretching across the valley. When he passed it down, the paperwork made it clear. This place was ours. I never thought I'd have to defend that fact, but here I was, standing in front of an officer who was trying to make sense of the shouting match between me and Karen. She pointed at me, insisting I was squatting, her voice rising with each word. I stayed calm, but inside I felt that tension boiling, because if there's one thing I knew, it's that people like her never stop pushing until they're forced to face the truth. The officer asked for proof, and that's when I realized this wasn't just about one heated argument. This was about setting the record straight for good. What happened next would change how everyone in that valley saw me, and Karen had no idea what she was up against. The officer shifted his weight, glancing between Karen's sharp accusations and my steady silence. He asked me again for paperwork, and I could see Karen smirking as if she already knew how this would end. What she didn't count on was that I had come prepared. I pulled out the worn leather folder I kept in the cabin deeds, maps, and records. My grandfather had carefully preserved. The officer looked at them, brow furrowing, while Karen grew restless, pacing like a cat waiting to pounce. But instead of settling things, the documents only raised more questions. The officer admitted the property lines were confusing, overlapping with HOA claims that didn't hold up legally. It wasn't black and white, at least not on paper. And that was all Karen needed. She seized the moment, declaring that until a judge stepped in, I had no right to be there. Her voice carried across the valley, and within the hour, a couple of curious neighbors arrived, whispering and pointing toward the cabin. Suddenly, this wasn't just an argument, was turning into a spectacle. One neighbor, a man named Mark, quietly approached me. He leaned in and said he'd had his own run-ins with the HOA, that Karen wasn't the first to overstep. He hinted that the board had been eyeing this valley for years, hoping to fold it into their jurisdiction to raise fees and expand control. That explained Karen's obsession. but it also made things more dangerous. The officer radioed for a supervisor, saying the situation was bigger than expected, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the valley. I realized this wasn't just about proving ownership anymore. It was about standing up to an entire system that thought it could rewrite history. And the fight was only beginning. By the next morning, word had spread through the community like wildfire. Trucks and SUVs lined the dirt road, neighbors standing in clusters, waiting to see how things would unfold. Karen was in her element, strutting around with a clipboard, pointing toward the cabin like it was some kind of crime scene. You kept repeating the same line that the HOA had jurisdiction and that I was in violation just by being there. Every time she spoke, more heads nodded, and I could feel the weight of the crowd pressing against me. The officers had returned. This time with a supervisor who carried a thicker binder of documents. He spoke carefully, explaining that the situation wasn't simple. The HOA's maps were outdated, and there were missing filings that blurred the boundary lines. Karen interrupted at every turn, insisting the cabin sat inside their community. But the more she pushed, the more cracks began to show in her story. Still, the tension only grew. Mark stood by me, quietly reminding me that I wasn't alone. But even he admitted the HOA had a history of twisting facts to get their way. Karen rallied a few board members who arrived with folded arms, whispering strategies as if preparing for battle. Their goal wasn't just about removing meat, it was about claiming the valley once and for all. As the crowd swelled, the air felt heavier, charged with something no one could ignore. The officer announced they'd need to see final proof of ownership before making any decision. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my next move. Karen's smirk returned, certain I wouldn't have what it took. And that's when I knew the climax of this fight was right in front of me. And the valley's future hung in the balance. I stood there with everyone's eyes fixed on me. The officer waiting, Karen grinning like she'd already won. I opened my folder again, ready to hand over the deed, when another voice cut through the tension. It was an older man I didn't recognize at first, stepping out from the crowd with a rolled-up map in his hands. He introduced himself as Samuel, one of the original surveyors of the valley. His presence alone shifted the energy. People quieted down, curious, even uneasy. Samuel said he'd kept copies of old land surveys records that most people had forgotten about. He unrolled the map across the hood of the police SUV, his finger tracing thick black lines that didn't match the HOA's claims. Karen tried to wave him off, insisting he was confused, but the map showed something startling. Not only did my deed cover the cabin and the valley floor, but it also extended into the hillside where new homes had been built under HOA control. The silence that followed was heavier than anything so far. Neighbors began murmuring, realizing this conflict wasn't just about me staying in the cabin. It was about whether their own houses were standing on land that legally belonged elsewhere. Karen's face went pale for the first time, though. She tried to recover quickly, declaring the survey outdated and irrelevant, but the damage was done. Doubt was spreading, and the officers were listening closely. The stakes had just exploded. This wasn't a personal dispute anymore. It was a question of who really owned the valley, the ridges, and even parts of the neighborhood itself. And with every word Samuel spoke, the ground under Karen's feet seemed to crumble. The valley had never been so quiet. All the neighbors leaned in as the officer studied Samuel's survey against my deed. His supervisor compared signatures, dates, and stamps, his expression shifting from cautious to certain. Finally, he looked up and said the words that changed everything. The land was legally mine, not just the cabin, not just the valley floor. The hillsides, the creek, even the roads leading into the HOA's prized neighborhood, all fell under my ownership. Karen exploded. shouting that it was impossible, that the HOA had governed here for years. But the officer cut her off, explaining that the HOA had no legal standing over property it didn't own. A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors looked relieved, others furious. Karen's smirk was gone, replaced by panic as the reality set in. She had called the police on the very person who controlled more land than anyone else in the valley, and just when it seemed like the fight was over, Samuel cleared his throat. He revealed that my grandfather had placed a clause in the deed long ago. Any attempt by an outside group to seize or claim the valley would automatically revoke their rights to use its natural resources, including the access road and water lines. The crowd gasped. Without realizing it, the HOA had built their community on land tied to my family's legacy, and that clause meant I held the key to their future. The climax hit like a storm. Karen's power was gone in an instant. The board members stood speechless. And every neighbor knew the truth. The valley was mine. But what I chose to do with that power, that was the twist none of them saw coming. The crowd slowly began to disperse, though the whispers didn't stop. Some neighbors looked embarrassed for ever siding with Karen, while others approached me with quiet relief, finally free from the HOA's constant grip. Mark clapped me on the shoulder, reminding me that the valley wasn't just land. It was history, and now everyone finally understood that. The officers left after confirming the records. Their part in the conflict finished, though the impact of what had been uncovered would linger for years. Karen, on the other hand, refused to admit defeat. She stormed off down the road, her voice carrying threats about lawsuits and appeals. But everyone had seen the documents, and Samuel's survey backed them up beyond question. Whatever she tried next would only dig her deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of. For the first time, I didn't feel angry at her, felt a strange sense of pity. All her energy had been spent trying to control what was never hers. Over the following weeks, things in the valley changed. The HOA backed away quietly, no longer claiming authority over land they didn't own. Neighbors began approaching me, not as an opponent, but as someone who could help preserve the valley's peace. I decided not to enforce the harsh clause my grandfather had left behind. Instead, I opened a conversation with the community, making it clear that as long as the land was respected, the valley would remain a place for everyone to enjoy. Looking back, the fight with Karen was exhausting, but it revealed something important. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting property. It's about protecting legacy, freedom, and the truth. And in the end, that was worth more than anything.